Hello, I'm James Macquarie, one of the founders at GLAD. This is our Breaking Down Climate Pollution podcast, in which we ask AI to generate a deep dive conversation based on a climate science or policy document we'd like to learn more about. In this episode, we asked the AI to take a deep dive into a white paper from the fine folks at Milky Wire titled Guidance for Setting an Internal Carbon Fee, in which they introduced the intriguing concept of internal carbon fees, a bold step companies are taking to put a price on their carbon footprint. Let's dive in.
Ever feel like when companies say they're going green, it's more talk than action?
Yeah, definitely. It's a lot of buzzwords sometimes.
Right. So today we're looking at something that seems more, concrete internal carbon fees. Basically, companies putting a price tag on their own carbon footprint.
It's an interesting concept, right? Like they're holding themselves accountable financially. Instead of just saying, we'll reduce our impact, we're going to build that cost into how we do business.
It's like putting your money where your emissions are. We're basing our deep dive today on a white paper from Milky Wire. They're a platform that helps companies fund climate action. And they've put together this really thorough guide to setting up these internal carbon fees.
Yeah, and it's not just about offsetting, not just planting a tree for every ton of CO2 and calling it even. This white paper gets into how these fees create a dedicated fund, one that goes beyond a company's own operations to support wider climate solutions.
Which is key because even the most sustainable company, they still have an impact, right? So how does this internal carbon fee thing actually work? Is it as straightforward as just slapping a price on each ton of CO2 they emit?
Well, I wish it were that simple. The Milky Wire paper gets into this idea of a credible fee. Not just any price, but one that really reflects the cost of those emissions to the environment and to society. They actually recommend a range of $100 to $200 per ton of CO2. And, important point, they say it should be adjusted for inflation.
Wow, that's a lot higher than some of the carbon offset programs out there. What's the thinking behind that?
It's about quality over quantity. See, those lower prices, a lot of times they reflect projects that maybe aren't as impactful, or they don't really get at the root causes of climate change. But a credible fee, that signals that a company is serious about investing in solutions that actually move the needle.
So it's not just a Band-Aid, it's like actually investing in a long-term solution.
Exactly. And another thing the white paper stresses is that there's no one-size-fits-all. They break companies down into groups based on their carbon intensity, how much CO2 they emit for, say, every dollar of economic output they produce, and their profit margins.
So a tech company, for example, with maybe a global reach but low emissions per dollar earned would be treated differently than, say, a manufacturing plant with a way higher carbon footprint.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance. And they illustrate this with some real-world examples. Like they talk about Klarna, the payment processing company. They've actually got this tiered fee structure in place.
Oh, interesting. What does that look like in practice, a tiered fee?
So Klarna, they have different fee levels depending on the type of emission. Their scope 1 and 2 emissions, those are the ones they have the most control over. Plus, their business travel, they charge themselves $100 per ton of CO2 for those. But for scope 3 emissions, those are trickier because they're further down the supply chain, harder to measure, right?
Yeah.
For those, they've got a lower fee, $10 a ton.
So they're acknowledging that some emissions are tougher to tackle, but still putting a price on them. Are there other companies using interesting approaches?
Yeah, definitely. Microsoft's been at the forefront of this. They use internal carbon pricing for things like investment decisions, and then a separate internal carbon fee to fund their external climate work.
Two birds, one stone. So they're baking the cost of carbon into how they operate while also giving back to broader solutions. What's their fee structure like?
They landed on $15 per ton for scope 1 and 2 emissions, $100 per ton for business travel. Interesting how that higher travel fee seems common, right? And for the rest of their scope 3, it's $8 a ton.
Again, putting more financial weight on the emissions they've got more direct control over. Any examples of companies being really aggressive with this?
One that comes to mind is Swiss Re, the reinsurance company. They kicked off a $112 per ton fee across all their emissions back in 2022. But here's the thing, they're planning to up that fee gradually, hitting $200 per ton by 2030.
Wow, talk about putting your money where your mouth is. Building in that increase over time makes it even more impactful. It's fascinating to see these different approaches. Each company's kind of tailored it to their situation, right?
Yeah, and that's a key takeaway from the Milky Wire paper. It's not about one solution for everyone. It's about finding what works for you to make a real difference.
It's about progress, not perfection. But they also acknowledge not every company can just jump into an internal carbon fee. What happens then? What are the alternatives?
And this is where I think the paper gets really practical. They talk about other ways companies can support climate action if they're not ready for the full-on carbon fee. They lay out a couple alternatives to that money for ton model.
Okay, so what other options are on the table?
One is what they call money for money. Basically, the company decides we're going to put this percentage of our revenue or our profits towards climate action projects.
So instead of directly linking it to emissions, it's like dedicating a portion of their financial success.
Exactly. Way simpler because you don't need to track emissions as meticulously.
Almost sounds too simple. What's the catch?
Well, the paper points out that because it's not tied to emissions, it kind of weakens the incentive for companies to prioritize reducing their own footprint. There's less direct financial consequence for those emissions, you see.
Like it's the difference between paying for every plastic bag at the store versus just a flat fee, right? One makes you think twice.
Exactly. Now, the other alternative is ton for ton. Basically, a company figures out its emissions and then funds external climate projects that remove or reduce an equal amount of CO2.
So more like traditional carbon offsetting.
Kind of, yeah. But again, the paper points out potential issues.
Like what?
Well, there's a risk of just going for the cheapest offset projects rather than ones with a bigger impact but maybe a higher cost. Like it'd be easy to just invest in a massive tree planting project because per ton of CO2, it's cheaper. Even if a new technology that sucks CO2 right out of the air, even if that's more effective long term, it's also more expensive per ton.
So it's not just about how much CO2 you address, but the quality of the solution.
Exactly. And it's hard to measure the real impact of some climate solutions. Take policy work or tech innovation. Those can have huge ripple effects, but how do you measure that in tons of CO2?
It sounds like both of those, while easier to do, they lack that direct link, that incentive that you get with a well-designed internal carbon fee. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, and I think the Milky Wire paper would agree. They present those options, but they're clear that the internal carbon fee, that's the gold standard. If companies can do it, that's what they should aim for.
So those internal carbon fees, they sound like they could be a real game changer. But you mentioned not every company could just dive right in. Those money for money and ton for ton models, they seem like decent stepping stones, even if they're not as impactful.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned they've got their limitations. Like, how could those be addressed? How do you make those alternatives more effective?
Yeah, you're right. Those alternatives have their pitfalls. Like the big one is that temptation to just go with whatever's cheapest, even if it doesn't really make a difference.
Right.
But there are ways to, to make those approaches more robust, to give them more teeth.
Okay, I like it. Let's hear it.
One thing is setting a really high bar for the types of projects that qualify for funding. So imagine, right? A company commits to only supporting projects that have been vetted by independent experts. Projects that meet strict standards for environmental integrity, social responsibility, and this is a mouthful, additionality.
Additionality.
Yes.
Okay, now you're just using big words to sound smart. Break that down for me.
All right. Additionality basically means making sure that the climate benefit from a project, it wouldn't have happened without the investment. So you're not funding something that was already in the works. You're making sure the money makes a difference.
So it's about making sure the money's actually driving additional climate action, not just greenwashing business as usual.
Gotcha. Exactly. And the good news is there are organizations that are dedicated to developing standards and ways to verify carbon offset projects. They're making sure the money goes to legit high impact stuff.
Okay, so even with these, let's call them stepping stone approaches, you can still make them more effective.
A lot seems to hinge on transparency though, right? Whether it's the internal carbon fee or these alternatives, being open about it seems crucial.
100%. Transparency is like non-negotiable. Companies have got to be open about how they're calculating things, where the money's going, what impact it's having. That builds trust, both inside the company and with, everyone watching.
Because otherwise it's just like a marketing tactic, right? Totally. Greenwashing is a real danger here. If companies aren't transparent, then these sustainability claims, they're just empty words. That's something I liked about the Milky Wire paper. They emphasize that it's not enough to just do something. You got to be open about how you're doing it.
Walk and talk the talk, authentically.
Exactly. And that goes beyond just numbers, you know? It's about telling the story of how a company is approaching sustainability, the struggles, the wins, what they've learned, bringing people along on that journey.
And hopefully inspiring others to take action too. Because this isn't about just one company going it alone. This is a whole mindset shift, right?
Yeah.
We're all in this together.
Absolutely. And this is super important when we're talking about Scope 3 emissions. You know, those indirect emissions from a company's supply chain, those are tough to measure and manage, and they often make up the biggest chunk of a company's impact.
Yeah, because they're often outside a company's direct control.
Yeah.
That makes collaboration even more important.
Exactly. Companies need to work together with their suppliers, their customers, even their competitors to tackle emissions across the whole value chain. And this is where those alternative approaches, the money for money and ton for ton, can be surprisingly useful.
Really? I would have thought the direct link of the internal carbon fee would be the best way to handle Scope 3.
It makes sense on paper, but think about it. Say a company's committed to reducing their Scope 3, right? But a lot of their suppliers might be smaller businesses. They might not have the money or the know-how to do internal carbon pricing themselves.
Ah, I see. So the bigger companies, they can help out, provide some support where it's needed.
Exactly. So these larger companies, they can use money for money or ton for ton to actually give financial and technical help to their suppliers, help them measure and reduce their emissions.
So it's like a ripple effect.
You got it.
Right.
And that collaboration goes way beyond just money, you know? Companies can share what's working, offer training, even work together on things like sustainable sourcing or making their transportation greener.
It all comes back to that interconnectedness we were talking about. We can get so much more done by working together, right?
Couldn't agree more. That sense of partnership, that shared responsibility across the whole value chain, it's essential.
And it's not just on businesses either. We as individuals, we can push for change too, right? Like what we choose to buy, that sends a message.
Oh, for sure. Choosing to support companies that are walking the walk on sustainability, asking tough questions, raising our voices, whether it's on social media or however, it all makes a difference.
Aligning our dollars with our values. I like it.
Right. And this is another place where storytelling matters. When companies are upfront about their sustainability journey, the good and the bad, it resonates. It makes it feel achievable for others.
It's about progress, not perfection. Showing that every step towards a more sustainable future matters.
Exactly. It's about being real about the challenges, celebrating the wins, and bringing others along. We need everyone, right? Businesses, governments, investors, individuals, we got to work together on this.
And this whole conversation about internal carbon fees, whether it's companies or even us thinking about it on a personal level, it highlights something really important. It's about recognizing our impact, taking responsibility, and then putting our resources, our money, our time, our energy towards solutions.
Well said. It's about moving away from business as usual and towards a way of doing business where sustainability is built in from the ground up. It's not an afterthought, it's a core value.
Because a healthy planet and a healthy economy, they go hand in hand.
Absolutely. This isn't just about saving the planet for the future. It's about creating a better future for everyone right now. More just, more equitable, more prosperous.
Now that's a future worth striving for.
I agree. A future where businesses aren't just about profits, but they're driving positive change for people and the planet.
A future where sustainability is just like how we do things. It's not a special thing. It's just the norm.
And a future where we see ourselves as part of nature, not separate from it.
Beautifully put. And the cool thing is, this isn't some far-off dream. We are building it step by step, every single day with the choices that we make.
It's a journey, not a destination, right? And every step towards sustainability brings us closer to a brighter future, one that we all have the power to shape.
To dig a little deeper into that power, I want to circle back to the Milky Wire paper. You mentioned some really interesting stuff before about their approach to carbon removal. Let's get into that. So, carbon removal, it feels like that's the next big thing, going beyond just trying to reduce emissions. What stood out to you in the Milky Wire white paper about that?
Honestly, it was how balanced they were. They get that net zero isn't just about slowing down emissions, it's about actually pulling that CO2 we've already put out back out of the atmosphere. And they're upfront about how much investment that's going to take, both in like natural solutions and new technologies.
And like we've got to hit the brakes and clean up the mess we made, all while inventing a better engine for the future, right?
Perfect analogy. They really emphasize that we need a whole bunch of different approaches, like reforestation, and making sure our soil can store more carbon. Those are good. But we also need things like direct air capture, where you're literally sucking CO2 out of the air, and bioenergy with carbon capture, using nature and pushing tech forward.
So kind of like with renewable energy, it's not about picking one winner, it's about supporting a whole ecosystem of solutions. For removing carbon in this case.
Exactly. And this is where internal carbon fees, they can be a really important catalyst.
How so? Even if a lot of companies adopt them, can they really drive something as big and complicated as carbon removal?
Think about it. When companies have to pay for their carbon, it gives them a reason to find ways to lower those costs, right? Right now, carbon removal, it's still new, so it's more expensive than the usual ways of reducing emissions. But if companies have that money set aside from their internal carbon fee, they can use it to close that cost gap to help these new technologies develop faster.
So they're basically creating a market for it within their own company.
Exactly. And the paper gives some good examples of this. We talked about Swiss Re before and how they're putting money into carbon removal tech. And then there's Stripe, the payment company. They're putting at least $1 billion towards carbon removal by 2030. They're using internal carbon pricing and just straight up investing.
That's awesome to see that level of commitment.
Yeah.
It does feel like we're at this point where taking action early, even if it's expensive now, is going to determine if these technologies can really work long term.
Definitely. And as the climate crisis gets more urgent, I think we'll see more and more companies realizing that carbon removal is just necessary. And all that investment, it'll help bring the costs down so more organizations can afford it.
So it's like a snowball effect.
Yeah.
Early adopters, they pave the way.
Exactly. And that's what I think is so cool about this Milky Wire paper. It's not just theoretical, it's practical. It's like, here's how you actually do this. It acknowledges the challenges, but it also shows how much opportunity there is.
It's that balance of, this is serious, but we can do this, which I think is what we've been talking about this whole time, right? It's not just about what internal carbon fees are, but why they matter and how they can work.
Yeah, and more than anything, I hope people listening come away feeling empowered. Climate change, it's a huge challenge. But we can tackle it. We've got the tools, we've got the knowledge, and now more and more the financial incentives are lining up to transition to a sustainable future.
Absolutely. It's about all of us, individuals, organizations, everyone stepping up and realizing we have a part to play, whether it's pushing for policy changes, thinking about what we buy, or, like we've been talking about, demanding businesses do better.
Yeah.
It all adds up.
Well said. And I think this conversation about internal carbon fees, it's just the start. It shows how our thinking is changing. We're realizing that we can't separate a healthy planet from a healthy economy. They're connected.
And realizing that, that's huge. Because in the end, we're not just trying to save the planet. We're trying to create a future that's better for everyone. Fairer, more just, more prosperous.
A future where businesses aren't just about making money, but about making a positive difference for people and the planet.
A future where sustainability isn't some goal we're trying to reach. It's just how we do things.
Exactly.
Well, on that note of possibility, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive for today. We covered a lot, but more importantly, I think we explored a path forward. It's been great chatting with you, and I hope everyone listening is feeling not just informed, but inspired.
The feeling is mutual. Let's all keep learning, keep innovating, and keep supporting each other as we figure this all out, because we're in this together.
To a future where sustainability is just reality.
Thanks for joining us.